Policy. I am Ahmedabad. We welcome Dr. Rinku Murgai, the esteemed gathering here. A very brief introduction about the speaker for today. So Dr. Murgai has been with the World Bank's Poverty Reduction Division since 2003, a doctorate in Agricultural Resource Economics from the University of California at Berkeley. She has worked in various divisions of the World Bank related to poverty, alleviation and other such humanistic departments, including public programs, social programs and functioning of rural and water treatments. So I think this will be a very lively session, and people interested in poverty alleviation and related fields would really learn a lot from it. Secondly, the moderator for today's discussion is Professor Ellen D'Souza, one of the most eminent professors of economics at IIM Ahmedabad. I believe he requires no further introduction among our students. So why don't we get the thing started? Okay.
It's a pleasure to welcome you, and I think I have no role here. It's really, the floor is yours.
Okay.
How long do you want to structure this?
So probably we can do this for 1 hour, maybe have a half an hour Q&A session.
Okay.
Does that sound good?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I'll try to not speak for the entire hour, but every time I present, I promise that, and then do you want me to use the mic?
Yeah, so let me, and then I'll come back if there's time to some puzzles, but you'll see those are puzzles that come very much from the measurement school, and that relates to the big debates that have been happening recently on poverty in India. So what is the, I mean, all of you must have followed discussions, if not in newspapers, at least on 9 p.m. TV talk shows. India's poverty numbers have never been really fodder for evening talk shows, but they have become of late in the last year and a half. And the reason that's happened, so what's the official story on poverty? If you look, here I'm just showing you the poverty rates as reported officially by the government, by the Planning Commission. And what you see on the left-hand panel is what the numbers are on rural poverty. The right-hand panel is urban. And the thing that I want you to focus on is essentially the fact that there has been a huge step up, a very, very big step up in the pace of poverty reduction since 2004-05. There was, when you look back historically at the pace of poverty decline in India from the 50s, 60s to the early 90s, it's been a pretty steady but slow pace of progress. Between 93 and 2004, that decade, we started seeing hints of something changing, of the pace of decline picking up. But it was a hint, it wasn't clear whether this would be sustained. The numbers that have been released since 2004-05 for 9-10 seem to suggest that pace has picked up. It doubled from, for example, in rural areas from 0.8% a year to 1.6% decline per year. What led to all the discussions on NDTV, etc., about this was the fact that there was a report of poverty reduction having and the pace having picked up much more between 2009 and 2011. It tripled, and this is very new, at least in our history. If you look at it, I'm going to just show you some facts based on the official numbers. If you look at income growth, so what I presented to you were poverty statistics. If you look at income growth, you also see a story, as you would expect, an increase in the rate of consumption growth between as you move from the 93-04 decade to the next 7-8 years. What's interesting is that it happens, the big increase happens between 9 and 11. And also important that you see it not just on average, you're also seeing it for the bottom 40% of the population. And that's reflected partly in what's on the right-hand side panel, which shows you that while inequality was increasing between 93 and 2004, it seems to have, the rate of increase seems to have stabilized. Those are the Gini coefficients, which is just, it's a measure of inequality. The higher it ranges between 0 and 1, the higher the number, higher is inequality. So there's been a big pickup in the pace of progress, but, and it's, what this graph shows you is that it's not an isolated phenomenon. You see an increase in the pace in most states. The line is just a 45-degree line. I'm showing you, I'm comparing the pace between 93, 2004 and the subsequent period to 2011. So in nearly every state after 2004, there's been, according to these numbers, much faster progress. And by some measures, poor states are catching up. It's not, all states have had faster progress. And if you look at convergence in terms of the absolute changes in the poverty rate, poor states are catching up. Divergence, if it's proportionate, and we can come back later to thinking about why that might be. Inequality has, as I mentioned, has stabilized after 2004 to 9 to 11, and that's evident in these two graphs. What you need to see is essentially on the left-hand side, there's an increase when you compare 93 to 2011, but most of that happened between 93 and 2004. When you compare 2004 and 2011 on the right-hand side graph, it lines up along the 45-degree line, essentially. So it's the, so inequality, so I mean, so the many indications based on the official data that things are improving, right? Poverty is declining much faster, inequality is not rising. The bottom 40%, their incomes are also growing. So it's a good story. It is a good story, and also it's very important in terms of numbers. I mean, the scale of improvements that are reported are just staggering. You know, so what I've showed you on this graph is that the distance between those lines is 100 million people. So according to these numbers, between 2004 and 2011-12, some 137 million people were lifted out of poverty, and this is an accomplishment considering that up until that time, even though the poverty rate was declining because of it wasn't declining at a fast enough pace to keep up with population growth. So you had in absolute numbers, the number of poor in India had been increasing. After 2004, you start seeing that come down. So when these, you know, I've just given you, I haven't done anything to the data, I'm just telling you, well, this is what the official numbers say. And there's many debates around this. I mean, the first one is basically, are the numbers plausible? And on that, I think we have to also keep in mind the context of when these were released. The government is, at least has been suffering from some sort of credibility deficit. There was accusations of data manipulation. The numbers were also released at a time when growth had started slowing down. So even though this is between 2004 and 2011, growth had started slowing down. So people were just like, you know, how is it possible that 137 million people are moving out of poverty? So we've done some work, at least based on looking at the numbers, and my own feeling is that, you know, there's no real, when you look at it from a number of angles, there's no smoking gun to doubt the numbers. I mean, so at least given these poverty lines, many things, when you start looking at them, they start squaring up. And when it's sort of consistent with evidence on expenditures, on sectoral growth patterns, on employment wage trends, and on the increase in transfer programs. So you could tell a story that would be consistent with this. And you can quibble with the poverty lines. I'll return to that, the issue of the poverty lines themselves. But I'll show you that the gains, these kinds of gains, are not driven by the choice of line. Now, having said this, we're doing a bunch of work, and I think it's not just us. There's a real need for serious research on some of the measurement issues, but, you know, I'll try to not bore you too much with that. But given that the country officially uses consumption poverty, there are some troubling things on the measurement side. I might touch upon them at the end, but not too much. Just to say that I don't think it's an entirely measurement-driven phenomenon. So let me turn to perhaps some of the more interesting debates. I mean, there was a huge debate, and I don't know how many of you followed it, on the poverty line itself. There's this, people refer to it as the 26-32 debate, you know, and you had essentially it started with the Planning Commission impleaded itself in the Supreme Court in the right to food case when they were asked how they set caps on the number of people who are entitled to the PDS, to the public distribution system. And so the Planning Commission impleaded itself by saying that, well, it's based on the poverty line, and the poverty line is X rupees per person per month. And that led to a very, very clever and colorful media campaign, and also by petitioners in the right to food case, who, when you translate that line into rupees per person per day, it's 26-32, you know, 26 rupees in 26 in rural, 32 in urban. Well, to an urban dweller, that does sound ridiculous, right? I mean, to say that the government treats that as the threshold for beyond which you are not eligible for support was, you know, there a lot of mockery ensued, and the people were carrying like dabbas of a bus ticket and you know, and other things that you could buy in 26 rupees, and saying, well, can you guys, can the urban elite and people in government actually live on that? So there was a lot of, I mean, I think it led to a couple of things. One is that it completely lost credibility in the eyes of public opinion. There were even politicians on both sides, in government and in the opposition, disowning this. And it also led to something that has been a relatively esoteric, academic kind of exercise of poverty measurement. It put the public gaze on it. And there's good reasons to worry about the line. Because when you compare it to non-monetary indicators, this is a measure of consumption. The 26-32 refers to how much people consume in a day. And the numbers, if you, based on that metric, would say 22% of India's population lies below that. And so that becomes India's poverty rate. But then I've just given you a couple examples here of, if you don't look at consumption or income poverty and you look at nutrition. Unfortunately, the National Family Health Survey, the last one that was done, it dates to 2005-06, and it's a most credible estimate of nutrition, a source of nutrition information. It suggests that nearly half the population of children below the age of 3 are underweight. You know, so it's hard to kind of square that with reports of incredible progress. But even internal to the survey that is used for measuring consumption poverty, when you look at caloric intakes, those have been declining over time. You know, so the percentage of population consuming calories below the recommended daily allowance has increased. So in 93-94 it was 68, in 2009-10 it's gone up to 82, and 2011-12, I haven't put the numbers here, it's gone up a little bit more even. So if you think that if you believe the RDAs and you think that a minimum caloric intake is important as a metric, then it doesn't square with the consumption poverty numbers. Well, so where have we ended up now is there is a new committee to produce a new line, and that committee will give its report sometime this year, probably after elections. We'll have to see where it comes out. But I think from my vantage point, I'll just make a couple comments. I mean, I don't think there is any particularly, there's no right line. It's sort of, it is necessary, it necessarily has to have some normative content to what a society, a country aspires to. When we look across the world, you see countries as they get richer, they do keep raising the line. Just to give you some benchmark, which may or may not be useful, when you look at the various committees that have set India's poverty lines, they have raised them. So the first committee that raised the line in 87-88, well, not the first, but the first one in recent history to have raised it is the Lakrawala committee. They raised the line in 87-88, then came the Tendulkar committee, that's the red line, they raised the line further. I'm giving you what the